Tuia I runga I arangi nui he tūnei, tuia I raro I a papatua nuku e takato nei. Ka rongo te ao te motu e te kōrero puata te marama ahu nuku te marama ahu rangi ka takato te aio. Tuia te rangi tokona te rangi te maunga rungu ki te whaiau ki te amarama. Tihei mauri ora. Mauri ora ki koutou he anga mai nei ki tō tātou nei o taka I tēnei pōtonu. Rā te kohu kārewa. Ka rewa ka ake anō te whakaaro ki rātou, kua takahi atu rā te ara puhana o ngā mātua. Rātou, te hunga pūhina-hina, ana kua takahi atu rā, kua anga atu rā ki te ao wairua. E tēnei wā tonu ka tuku atu rā te au inga te mai aro a, te muri aro a ki tō tātou nānga hinga mai te rangi nei. Nā ka tangihia mai rā pari roa pā, ka tangi roa mai rā Ngāti Tūpito, Ngāti Ruanui, ki a koe e tia, mehi ka wake rā ki te whānau, e noho pauri nei, I raro tēnei o ngā huatanga I weru hio mai rā, e ngā mātua a te puia o te pō. Ka anga atu rā no hoki tēnei kōrero ki tō tātou nei hoa, ara kia āchi, me tōna whānau anō hoki, e noho mamai I tēnei wā tonu, I te matengaro atu rā, o tōna reo, o tōna kanohi ki te ao mārama. Kōrua rā, kua whai wāanga ki te takahi atu rā, o tērā o ngā ara, o ngā mātua, o pōnui pōroa, te pō te hoki. Mai nori rā koutou rā, tuhunga mate. Nā ko koutou rā, ka tukuna, ka rere, ka tika. Tangihia mai rā, te kōroi ki koutou rā, e moi, mai rā te moi, au ai te moi, e rarau. Hoki toro tika mai rā ki tātou te ao mārama. Tātou e noho mai rā I raro I te maru o hiti tua toru mo etihi, tua wā mo etihi. Me tērā o ngā ngāngara kai tangata a COVID, kua tau ki runga I rungi te ao I tēnei wā tonu. Mehi ka wake rā ki koutou e tiaki, manaki, hāpoi ake, tērā wānau e roto I tēnei a huatanga, nā kua pāngia mai rā tātou. Kia kaha kia māia, kia manawa nui, kia piki te kaha ora te māramatanga ki rungi a tātou. Hoi anō, tātou e waiwahi nei te mātakitaki tēnei o ngā wāhanga o tātou, I raro te parirau o te korimaku o Taranaki mehi kawake, ana me te nui oki o ngā wakaāturanga, mo e tehi, e akoranga, e tehi, waka hono anō hoki ngā whanaunga o tērā pito, kia tūhono anō hoki a kupurau ko kōrero I raro I ngā karakia. Nori rā mehi ka wake rā ki koutou, ane anō hoki te tehi o ngā waanga. Tērā pēr, hei ngau mātou atu manawa, hei wakarongatanga mā koutou, hei te mirimiri I te ngā kautangata. Nori rā, tēnā koutou ko Te Poihi Campbell tēnei, e kawe ake rā tēnei o ngā rākau te ara takitaki nā tēnei o ngā hōtaka I tēnei pōtonu, tēnā koutou katoa. Ka te kitea mai rā, o tātou nei whanaunga, I hau mai nā I tēnei wā tonu, ngā pū kōrero, ngā pū mārama, hau mai rā ki te āta whera e tihi o ngā kōrero, nā te toko rua I wakarite. Nuri rā mahi kawake rā, kia koe Jamie o te rā, kōrua rā kia Hemi, ki tēnei o ngā pai kōrero, tūranga kōrero, wāra ki atu rā o koutou, o kōrua whakaaro I tēnei wā tonu. Nuri rā mihi ka wake. Tērā pēr ka tuku atu rā te Māori kōrero kia koe Jamie, nā tērā pēr mau anō e te hunga kupu, hei tuku atu rā ki te wānau wakarongo mai ana.
O tēnā koe Te Poihi, tēnā rā tātou. Ka pai hōkupu e Te Poihi e tui nei a tātou. Tātou kua piri mai, kua tata mai ki tēnei wānanga kōrero I te pōnei. Ki tō tātou ware kōrero I te pōnei. Tautuku ana I ngā mii ki a rātou kōrero, ki te pō, ana I roto I te wāiti nei. Hoi te anō rā he kitenga kanoe o ki ngā maara ki tō tātou ua. Kia āchi, ana koia te kai kawe I he nei kōrero I te rātou. Ana kua ngaro haia, ana ki hōna rārangi mātua I te pō. Nō reire, tangi tonu ana te ngākau. Hoi te anō rā, ko rātou ki a rātou. Ana nei rā tātou ngā moreu. Ngā moreu. Ana hei tuku he tahi kōrero, kua rongo nei ngā taringa, kua kite nei ngā watu I roto I ngā tau. Hei wānangatanga mā tātou, he waka māmai. Ia tātou e no o au maru nei ki o tātou kāinga. Nō reire, mihi ana ki a tātou e te wānau.
Ai, kia wai ake te eo ngā kōrero ki runga ki raro ki o tātou hua ka ngaro nei. Ka tiko ki ka hoki te whakaro ki tō tāua pau i tērā atu tau. I tērā tau ki tō tāua hoa ki a āchi ka ngaro nei. O te anō ngā mea, ngā mate e hinga nei i tēnā kāinga, i tēnā pito o tō tātou maunga tēnei. Ka wai te io tērā kōrero, he mihi kaua ke katangi te ngākau. O te anō e te kana o rātou kua mārewa ki ngā pai, ngā hautā hengi ki te ai o mō wairoki ho rātou ki a rātou. Ka paira e te poihi tō tātou wānanga i tēnei pō, kua hoki nō mai tātou i tēnei tau, ka hoki nei ngā mahara ki a tātou kōrero i tērā tau. O te anō ai hiki ake i te tau maatanga, kia mārewa, kia mahe ake pēr te kite i te kohu, kua tau nei ki runga ki a tātou. O te anō tēnei, ngā tangata e mātakitaki mai ana tēnā koutou i o koutou kāinga o te tumanako ka whaihua i te pito kōrero i te pōnei. Tēnā tātou.
Tēnā kōrua. O tira, koutou e kaha nei ki te mātakitaki wakarongo maina ki tēnei o ngā otaka wakātūranga. Nā ka ngā atura i tēnei wā ki tō tātou nei maunga. Te maunga huka, kua tauhi mai rā, te huka ki runga iaia. E pēhi atura ki te rangi i tēnei rangi māia. Nā ka whai whakaro anō ki tātou. Nā ki ona tini awa, pēra hoki ki ngā tini kōrero. Ka re kore, kua wakaritia mai rā e kōrua rā e te hunga kōrero, kua whai pāranga ki tō tātou nei maunga. Kōrero tanga mā tātou.
Tēnā koe te poi, tēnā rā tātou. So kia ora whānau, what we're going to do this evening is kia reo rua ngā kōrero. Because we're mindful that not all of our whānau have particular command of the reo. And so Hemi and I will tag team. We've got some kōrero that we've pulled together. And really with a focus on our maunga. And so we thought, first and foremost, identifying or just drawing on some of the narratives that we have around the maunga in relation to how our maunga taranaki came to be. And we've got a couple of slides, so I'll just ask that we bring the first slide up. And, you know, this is entitled Ko te kāwi maunga, te kāwi Māui. And many of you will be familiar ko tēnei tangata, tēnei toa, tēnei atua Māui. And we thought it sort of useful to start with this particular narrative. Ko tahuarangi te waka ko Māui mua te tangata. And so referencing Māui Mua, who is an older brother of Māui Pōtiki, but a lot of our kōrero around the maunga and taranaki references the waka tahuarangi. So many of you will be familiar with that narrative when Māui goes out fishing, but for taranaki, the consistent narrative around the maunga is ko tahuarangi te waka, ko Māui Mua te tangata, ko rangi tuku te ao, ko piki mai rawea te matau. Which references rangi tuku being the line by which the fish was caught, piki mai rawea being the fish bone, the hook bone, and there are other sort of elements around the matau, the hook. Ka mau ki te uru a tonganui, ko haha te wenua tika ki ro wai. And so it references ka mau ki te uru a tonganui, so that narrative, the hook, caught on to Te Uru a Tonganui, which was the whare in ko haha te whenua tika ki ro wai. So the name of the fish whilst it was in the water was ha'a te wenua. And I think, you know, when we start to look at these particular kupu and we look at a'a te wenua, what we see is a'a. If we think about what a'a is, and we think about what this narrative speaks to us about, it's actually talking about how the island came to be, how Te Korua Māui came to be. And so it references a'a te wenua, so speaking of the fact that haha being sort of lava that formed under the water, ka ia kirunga koi ai huai nai te ingoa ko Te Korua ha Māui e takoto nei. And then so once the fish emerged at the surface, it became Te Korua Māui. And then i roto i ngā kōrero, he maha ngā kōrero e pāna ki ngā tuakana Māui Pōtiki, but in the kōrero it references ngā Māui roto I kuti kuti peka peka I wakaraua. And so, you know, that narrative about once the fish emerged, what Maui's brothers did. But here it is, hei wenua mōwai. For what purpose is this land? Hei wenua mo te kāui maunga. We also see in other writings, te ranga Māui, so referencing te kāui Māui, te ranga Māui, and then kumiake te kāui maunga kia ora te marino I teika rere I hoai, ngā wai te pō uri uri, te pō tangotango I te pō I kimia, ka puta mai ai ngā maunga kōrero, huri te motu nei, ko taranaki e tū nei. And so we thought it useful just to go back and reference this narrative which speaks about, you know, the fish emerging from the ocean, and that, of course, when you think about those high points of Te Karoa Māui, what, you know, they are the things that you see, right? They emerge first, and it's through that narrative that it speaks to the coming of the mountains. Koe no ka tukunatu kia koe hei kōrero āpiti mo tēnei rere ngā kōrero.
I better turn my mute off, eh? Yeah, I think it's important to think about the fact that there's quite strong references here to Maui Mua through some of the kōrero that we've kind of been privileged to have shared to us. That doesn't mean to say that Maui Pōtiki doesn't feature at all, because I think if you think about the Maui clan, I think that's the way we think more about te kāhui or te ranga Maui as a clan. And so so you see in this context, particularly ko tahu ārangi te waka ko Maui Mua te tangata, I aia te waka I a rātou I puta ake ki te moana ki te hi te ika. Ka eke a Maui ki roto ki taua waka ka hi a te ika. And so I think that's a pretty important context. Tēnei mea ko te uru o Tonganui. Te uru is the place in the house where the fish hook took hold of Tonganui's house. Ko haha whenua te ika. I have also heard that term in the context of it being a when the land moves like lava and ka ea ki runga. So they're all important kind of images that have come through during this kind of time when we have the formulation of the land. I think, well, we thought it was quite important to set a little bit of a context and a narrative about the formation of the mountains. So that's not to say also that we've that the kōrero about navigation and Maui's role and play in this kind of context wasn't important as well, because that features also through these kōrero about his role in fishing up the land was kind of we've heard, and a lot of people watching this kōrero will be aware that this process is also about navigation. So we've just put this out there for a little bit of a wānanga with us tonight. Yeah. And
so the key thing here is a lot of our karakia, a lot of our poi, reference tahuarangi, reference te ranga o te kāhui Māui. You have a lot of references to the brothers, Maui Mua, Maui Roto, and Maui Pōtiki, in terms of the matau of Maui Mua, the matau of Maui Roto, and the matau of Maui Pōtiki. You have the brothers also referenced as being sort of elements or parts of the waka. Kea Maui Mua te kei, te taurapa, Maui Roto nāna te tauihu, and then, kea Maui Pōtiki te awarua. So the important thing is, that we have these references to Maui and this imagery. And just before we came on to air, Te Poihi shared one of the poi karakia from his tupuna's book, which is also a karakia, a poi that of Taranaki iwi, which references again, kuti kuti peka peka, And so it references no mai ki roto I te ware kia ukia ho mate, kia ranga ho mate, te mate o te wenua, te mate o te tangata. And then, referencing again this sort of narrative in this story, and it continues on. But I think, just useful. I think, taranaki kōrero, taranaki narrative, and it speaks to how the island came to be, and it's got that sort of taranaki, it's taranaki kōrero.
Probably just to add to that, I know there's a lot of kōrero about Piki mai rawea, te matau, being the name of the jawbone of Muri Rangawhenua. I think it was his grandmother's, one of his ancestors anyway, Maui's ancestors' jawbone, made a patu and also made a matau as well. The patu to slow down the sun and the matau to hook up a te ikarua, a Maui. A couple of the haha te whenua, that references is used a lot around the heathing of the movement and the growing and the volcanoes, the growing of the earth. So the haha, the breathing earth, and it's referenced as being, the lands of the ika being the lands. An interesting word here, anā kāia ki runga. So ka pue is probably a word that's pretty similar to what you would see in other kōrero, but in this instance is ka ia ki runga. So that's another like an indication. If you hear people use some of these reading a kōrero, there's a possibility that they got these kōrero from these particular narratives. And as you can see, using ha maui e takoto nei, some other sort of little references to the written language that Taranaki used. But just like Jamie's sort of alluded to, a lot of the kōrero that you may see around that were written by our people by our tupuna have references that tie straight and directly to this particular narrative. I remember seeing a narrative written by, I think it was Maui Pomare, and he uses, actually it was, Maui Pomare, I think it was Te Urua Tonganui. And it was sort of like the first time I sort of seen that used. So this, and then I knew straight away that, okay, this must be a Taranaki kōrero being referencing this particular ingoa, Urua Tonganui.
Yeah, and
the use of the term kuti kuti peka peka whakaraua is really is quite interesting as well. If we think about the actions of some of Maui, which Maui, in this context, Maui Roto's actions in chopping up the land, I think is a really interesting concept. In that, that action of kuti kuti and peka peka and kind of forming and shaping the deep valleys and mountain ranges is quite interesting. The term of whakaraua is another really interesting term. So I assume that was kind of tamed in some way, or maybe, for want of a better term. That I don't hear often in other parts of the rohe. That's not to say that they're not common, but that term i whakaraua kuti kuti peka peka is I've seen in probably 3 or 4 other karakiatanga kōrero. The way in which Maui Roto has kind of tamed or set out the land in a way that we kind of see it today.
And then that particular concept was applied, the karakia we spoke about earlier, Te Poihi, te mate o te wenua, te mate o te tanga, te takoto nei, te ika nui, te ika roa, te ika wakaraua, kuti kuti peka peka. And so it was recontextualized during a time by which the land was taken. And so again, I guess it really just speaks to the power of the tupuna kōrero and I guess the skill in which our old people were able to apply these concepts to new circumstances and challenges that they faced. And so, it became they are likened the land confiscation in the way in which the land was being taken and divided by tauiwi to the sort of act of Maui roto. And then, of course, you know, that theme around Te Korua Maui is carried forward in terms of the carved house at Waitara. Again, a beautiful play on words in terms of the role that Tā Maui had in terms of the land confiscations, but also the house signifying whenua, you know, Te Korua Maui. We could probably, so that's just to give the whānau a bit of a sense of some of our narrative. And so, you know, from the time the fish has emerged, e takoto ana te wenua nei me ngā maunga, and then he hanga kōrero mo taranaki ai e tuana kiuta, hoki wēnei mai ki te kāinga ki te taiuru. So we'll look at the next slide, and Hemi can sort of just take us through some of these key kōrero.
Yeah, so this kind of period prior to that, obviously Maui kind of sets the context in terms of how the mountains have came to be, or how the land or the North Island has come to be. And so we have the formation of Te Kahui Maunga and Te Kahui Tipua in the Central Plateau area. And so we thought we'll shift from the Ranga Maui down to across to us here in Taranaki and talk about the haeretanga mai o te maunga. And so we've pulled a few kind of bullet points out here that we thought would be best to kind of capture that activity. But what this kōrero speaks to in our mind is this is the kind of cataclysmic activity in the way in which mountains have moved over a period of time from the Central Plateau, particularly in Taranaki's case, to us here on the Western Seaboard. And so these kind of bullet points here seems like quite a bit of kōrero, but we'll kind of zip through and see how we go, in the hope that it captures kind of the key themes and the key points of te haeretanga mai o Taranaki ki tēnei, ki te taiuru. And so it's kind of described in a way as a he wheketere mai a Taranaki no taupo i te whawhai rawa ko tongoriro mo tā rawa wahine mo pihama. So that won't be foreign to most of us that have a little excuse me know a little bit about the narrative about Taranaki's coming here. So it's premised on the fact that Tongariro and Taranaki were at conflict with each other over this their wahine pihanga. So the concept of wheketere is a really, really lovely visual word, I think, and we've kind of we've articulated it as the way in which an octopus kind of moves across the land, and the way in which it kind of glides across the land. That's the way in which the mountain has kind of been described in terms of its movement down through the Wanganui River. Ko Pukeonaki, that was, a lot of us will know, in Taranaki iwi's context at least, ko Pukeonaki ke hoki te ingoa tuatahi I tōna nohonga atu I Taupō. Taranaki was formerly known as Pukeonaki when he resided in the Central Plateau. And during that conflict with Taupō, I horo ia Tongariro, kuia te tewe o te matamata o Taranaki. What is the tewe? Jamie, you might want to contact.
Yeah. It's
the scar. Now, like we were told, it was the scar that's currently on the shoulder of Taranaki. Ko te matamata, that's the shoulder or the side or the face of Taranaki, and the tewe is a big scar and a big wound from battle. And nā tongariro I patu, ka whenuku iho te tihi, which my understanding is Tongariro's tihi was also affected during that conflict. But as a consequence of that conflict, ka maunu ha Pukeonaki, ka hau mai I raro I te whenua, ko tōna hoa ko te toko a rauhoto. And so Pukeonaki, I won't say dived, but travelled underneath the land, and actually came out in the sea. But his hoa haere was te toko a rauhoto, and a lot of us won't be unfamiliar with that stone, and that guide stone is currently on the marae at Pūniho, and ko rātou ngā kaitiaki o tērā tupuna kōhatu. E kōrero anō? Fellas want to add anything?
No, pai tonu. Haere
I
tonu.
was just thinking about the tiwi o te matemata. I know that one of our kōrero from down Ruanui and Ruahine is the rangitoto, the scar that was left behind. So when Taranaki actually, well, ia te kōrero, kua ripihia mai rā te pakitaro o Taranaki maunga ki Tongariro. Kai a rātou tētihi wahanga o te maunga, and that's part that te tiwi o te matamata is part and parcel of that narrative, and hence we have rangitoto as one of the scar points, as I see it. So that's probably just a hāngai to that particular line, te tiwi o te matamata o Taranaki.
Well, that makes sense. So what happened was Pukeonaki on his journey to the west, ka uru ki roto ki te moana nui a kiwa, ka whakaputa ke ki runga. And so his journey was out to the sea, was seaward, but he emerged out in the western seaboard, and then when he emerged, ka kite ia pauaka ia tuana. And what he did then was travel the kōrero that Jamie and I have, at least from Taranaki, or one part of Taranaki iwi, was that ka uru ki te mā te Hangatahua. So he came up the Hangatahua Valley and stood next to, emerged again, ka Tūtahi Rawa, emerged and stood next to Pauakai. And so the kōrero then says, ka uru te pukeao o Taranaki ki roto ki ngā pori ho Pauakai, ana ka ai Rawa. So ka whakauru te pukeao means the clouds and the mist rolled over the wrinkles and the valleys of Pauakai, and whereby they came as one, became as one, and ka ai rāua.
Yeah. And
koutou ngā mea ka rei te mohi o ki tēnei mea te ai, ana mā koutou e kimi, mā koutou e rapa.
Nā, ko te rerenga roa o tēnā kōrero ne, Hemi, ka ai rāua, he ure te kohu ha Taranaki. And that's a beautiful thing, right?
Yeah.
And
so from that union came...
Hei āpiti atu rā ki taua kōrero, Jamie, anā ka puta mai rā he kohu, he pepeke a aitanga, he tuputupu. Nō reira, koe nā ngā tuputupu I runga I te maunga, nā runga, nā tā mea I ai rāua, kātahi ka puta o nā uri, āna uri.
Ka ai rāua ka puta ko ngā tuputupu, ko ngā ngārara, ko ngā pepeke, ko te manu, ko te wai, he rā mea katoa. So from that union came the insects, the trees, the plants, and various waterways. But what happened during that time, or not long after that time, ka kitea ngā tangata nunui o te whenua I taua wā. So those prominent leaders of the time, well, it suggested, the kōrero we have suggested that there were people here during that time. And so we have the next line, which is ka paua e maru whakatare. What happened was maru whakatare and the community that were living in and around the maunga at that point in time decided to, as you would do if a new mountain turns up, is to carry out ceremony. And maru whakatare I pau te maunga, ka u ai te maunga ki reira. So it was maru whakatare that anchored the mountain in place through ritual and ceremony. And in following the role that maru whakatare played, ka pikitia e tahurangi. Tahurangi then climbed the mountain and lit a fire. And that is symbolised today in kōrero about te pukeao a Taranaki, ko te ahi a tahurangi, and also ko te pukeao o Taranaki, which is the clouds that emerge in the morning and also in the afternoon. he puke au I te awatea, and he puke au hoki I te ahi. So those things are symbolized in the way in which the mountain was anchored into this region. And then, of
I think
course,
just in addition, when we think about, fire, we think of auahi, smoke. It's, of permanence, of occupation, of mana. So key symbols, in terms of connecting the iwi to, our maunga, our tupuna, and the landscape.
Yep. Yeah, they're all tied up with ritual.
Hence the ahi kārua kōrero.
Yep.
Ahi kārua, te ahi o te haukainga.
Yeah, they're symbolized with ritual, yeah, and ko te ahi kārua me te puke ao, he tohu no te mana, he tohu no te whenua. So, of course, then we have another chap called Rua Taranaki, ka haere a Rua Taranaki I te muriwai o hangataihua, ka kiria te rua hei no wanga mōna, hei ingoa mōna mōrunga I te maunga. So then Rua Taranaki ascended the mountain, ascended the Hangataihua River Valley, and there a cave was excavated, and that became a place for him to lay his head, a place for him to live for a while, and a place for him to carry out rituals to kind of embed the name of the mountain, his name across the mountain. So that hence the name ko te rua o Taranaki, ko Rua Taranaki. And so, as Jamie suggested, when you look at the kind of ritual process, one is to anchor the mountain through karakia, another one is to assert mana over the land through the lighting of fires, and the other one is to have a name place your name across the mountain. And so it's through those things we have what we have today. And ka tūturu te ingoa Taranaki, ka kore ake tēnei ingoa Pukeonaki. But a bit of a disclaimer here, Jamie, Te Poihi, this is a particular Taranaki iwi kōrero, and of course those in the south and elsewhere will have other kōrero. Hopefully that might give some effect to this, or there could be something different as well. Ka pai.
Ka haere tonu.
Yeah.
So kua kōrero tea, te airetanga mai o te maunga ki te taiuru, Hemi, I wakaro ake māua te rapia ka titiro ki hētahi o ngā ingoa o tō tātou tupuna maunga, me hētahi atu o ngā maunga I tō tātou roe. And so I think it's, we've referenced earlier puke ōnaki, puke aupapa, and if I start with those two names, we all know what a puke is, right? They're very descriptive, and ōnaki. I know there's a narrative in parts of Taranaki which reference naki as being a person, but naki also, the word naki is to slope, and so puke ōnaki, which is again, it's actually just describing what is being seen in terms of, the sloping hill. Puke aupapa, kei te mo'i o tātou, ia a tēnei mea te aupapa, te ukapapa. So the fact that it is a snow-clad mountain or peak. And so, those were earlier names. As you saw in the narrative that was up before, once Taranaki came and was ascended by Tahurangi and then by Rua Taranaki, the name Rua Taranaki was placed on the maunga. And I think, in relation to that, it's really interesting because, some might say, well, is the maunga a person or is it this other guy? And we don't really distinguish, right? Because, from a Māori worldview standpoint, we are the environment as the environment is us. And we've got some other kupu kōrero, which demonstrate that relationship and connection between ourselves and our landscape. Mimi maunga nui, Hemi.
Yeah, so that That was the name of the mountain that preceded the arrival of Taranaki. So when Taranaki arrived, obviously that was taken over.
Yeah. So mimi maunga nui, rua Taranaki, so kua marama tātou, ko te ingoa nei, ko te tupuna nei a rua Taranaki. So we're familiar with that, and of course, you know, Taranaki, which many reference the maunga as today. We didn't want to put Egmont up there, so we left that off our list. And then I think, you know, when we think about rua Taranaki, rua tupua, and rua tawito, kei a koe pēr he tehi kōrero mō pauakai, te rua tupua, rua tawito e?
Ko te ingoa o pauakai i a te kāhui pau. So the old names for pauakai and kaitake, as we've seen and heard across a few accounts, is that we had those names were called rua tupua, rua tawito, and of course we have rua Taranaki as well. I think once the arrival of, or during the time of the Ngā Uruwaka, or the arrival of Ngā Uruwaka, then the names of pauakai and kaitake became more prominent, I think. But e ai ki te kōrero, ko pauakai i a te kāhui pau, tēnei maunga, which suggests that the kāhui pau were here a little bit before the arrival of the Kurahopo people, but definitely the accounts we've seen that kaitake became a little bit more prominent during the Kurahopo people's occupation. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you look throughout Taranaki, our early tupuna, before the arrival of the Uruwaka, you see it's quite prominent around, you know, ngā kāui. So, you know, kāui ao, kāui toka, we have te kāui pau in their relationship to pauakai. Ko te kāui rua kia kaitake him, you know, te kāhui rua, mahi keke, mahi rua, other prominent ancestors and narratives around sort of kaitake and pauakai. And so, you know, these early groups and the use of that early reference of kāui, you know, te kāui rere, te kāui tū, which you see in a lot of the early tupuna.
Yeah. So Te Iringa obviously there's a name called of a peak that's Te Iringa at this point in time. So that's another prominent name that's become quite prominent more recently across the Kaitake range, and the people at Puniho and Ngā Mahanga use that term quite regularly, Te Iringa, and Te Iringa New for the Kaitake range. And of course we have Patuha, which is another peak on the maunga as well. And we came across a kōrero from a rangatira called Tamati Weredu Te Ngāhuru, who describes the naming of Patuha as something along the lines of Ngā Mahirua, who was a Kurahopo ancestor, Ngā Mahirua I patu te atua o tēnei maunga, ka patua ki te oa mamaku, which is a mamaku leaf, Te Pai o ko Patuha. And so the name of that mountain became memorialized, and well, it seems like the name of that mountain became memorialized in that ritual and that process.
I think the interesting thing about that particular ritual, Hem, is the fact that you know, the use of the mamaku leaf, you know, ko te wā mamaku, and you know, when you go to certain parts of the maunga, you know, in terms of its vegetation, and it's very prominent, particularly in the ranges there.
Yeah. And of course, Panitai. Phantom's Peak.
Yeah.
Te kōrero anō tō koutou Te Poihi mō Panitai.
Oh.
We've seen also seen the area in and around Panitai described as the rangitoto or rangitoto. And when you're up there, you can see how and why that area is named like that, where you have a lot of red scoria in and around that area, ko te rangitoto. But so Panitahi commonly to some is panitahi is Phantom Speak, shortly soon to be changed, hopefully.
So I've heard it being called panatahi, but thing like the orphaned one, I've heard that as well. That being the orphaned one. So there must be a kōrero around how one is looking after, like Rua Taranaki is looking after the orphaned one. But that's probably all I can probably give at this time.
I think apiti atu I tēnā te poihi, ki te titiro tātou, ki te taueketanga o ngā maunga katoa, mai ia pari tūtū, ki kaitake, ki pauākai, ki taranaki, ki panitai. Pari tūtū geologically is the oldest of the maunga, and actually, as you move along, panitahi is the youngest. Which, and it's interesting because our narrative around te haeretanga mai o Taranaki and who was there, it sort of fits that theological sort of narrative around age and,
It's almost like te pōtiki. Rua pōtiki pia te ingoa mōna.
But te ingoa hou.
My maui pōtiki tati mai rā pia rua pōtiki.
But, the other thing around rua, rua again is another descriptive word in terms of a, you call it, the volcano at the top, a he rua. So you see that with tararua, rua pe'u, quite commonly used for maunga. Hoi te anō, he tahi ingoa kei runga I te maunga, me ngā ingoa o te maunga, nō reira, he kōrero anō. Got another slide. Well, he kupu kōrero henei. So we just thought, it's, when we think about our maunga, this is one narrative. It's a Taranaki iwi narrative, which speaks about, which links back to that kōrero that Hemi described earlier, he puke ao tā taurangi, which references the alpine cloud of Tahurangi. So again, that connection to Tahurangi being the first to ascend the maunga, to place that mana, that permanence upon Taranaki. He rua tā rua Taranaki. So as Hemi outlined earlier, once Taranaki arrived, Rua Taranaki ascended the maunga, dug out a cave, conducted ceremony and placed the name, and the name Rua Taranaki was placed upon the maunga. He pau tā maru wakatare, ko te paupau, ko te in-law tēnā o Rua Taranaki, ne? It was the father-in-law of Rua Taranaki. And so, this concept of pau is really important. He pau tā maru wakatare, he pau hoki tā tēnei wakatupuranga. And so when you think about that in the context of this enduring sort of physical and cultural connection that we have to Taranaki, and that permanence, it sort of goes back to these particular tupuna, who, it's not establishing mana, but actually sort of place that mana and affirm that connection between the people of that time to the maunga, which sort of continues on and endures today. And, when we stand up in other places and we say, ko Taranaki te maunga, ko mea te awa, it immediately places us on the landscape and within the world. And this is really just going through that ngā wakapapatanga kōrero in terms of those particular tupuna and the roles they played. Ko Taranaki te maunga, ko Taranaki te iwi, ko Taranaki te tangata, ko te puna I eke mai ai te tangata. Which I love, the spring from which we have emerged. It's a beautiful thing. When we can point to our relationship and our connection to Taranaki. Hoi te anō mau pia te ratu kōrero o Hem, ko te aroaro.
O tērā pia, hei āpiti atu rā ki tau kōrero. Jamie, ka kite atu rā te kupu pou. The pou has a special probably a conceptual reference in that Mauri Wakatare was one who consecrated the naming of Rua Taranaki. So he was the one who gave the karakia, and it was from that mana, from his pou, that ka heki iho mai rā tērā mana ki tēnei waka tupuranga. So I was just probably just highlight the point of the significance of the kupu pou e roto I tēnei o ngā karakia.
Yeah, pai tērā, and he pou hoki tā tēnei waka tupuranga. So that's an affirmation that, from that time to this, we also have not a right, well, it's a right, but we have a responsibility and an obligation to maintain that connection, that relationship, and exercise those obligations around that relationship to our tupuna maunga. And I guess, when we look at this other kōrero, I think it gives you a good sense of why. Kei a koe, Hem?
Yeah, that use of the word, the concept, and the idea or the value of the symbol of a pou is really, really important, because it inspires a kind of responsibility to maintain connected and a responsibility to play our part in this generation. Pou hoki tā tēnei whakatupuranga. It's almost a question like, what will be our responsibility and contribution back to either to the mountain. We've used this in the context of the negotiation as well, Jamie, to ensure that provides or sets a foundation for us to consider what will be this generation's, I don't know if legacy is the right word, but what will be this generation's legacy in respect of what is a key pillar of our identity. So moving on to the next kōrero, ko te aroaro o tēnei maunga o Taranaki, koia nei te tau arotanga. Ko au, no wainga nui tonu o te poho o tēnei maunga. So when we stand and look at the mountain and face the mountain, what do we see, or what's reflected back to us? The mountain, right? And so when we stand and we look at the mountain is a reflection of us as we look at him. And in that respect, we are a reflection of that mountain. And ko au no wainga nui tonu I te pō, saying I am from within the bosom or within the beating heart of this tupuna mountain of ours.
Yeah, beautiful, eh? We are a reflection of our tupuna, our maunga. So when we look at Taranaki, we see ourselves.
I like the use of the language koia nei te tauarotanga ko au. See, that simple line has a rich meaning to it. So whatever the context is, you are a reflection, or I am a reflection of that particular thing. So just using one line like that in a kōrero or in a mihi, that kind of sets you up where you can play around a bit as well. So koia nei te tauarotanga ko au. So it's beautiful kōrero.
Yep, no wainga nui tonu I te poho o tēnei maunga tupuna e tūnei.
Yeah, he rawe ne.
Beautiful.
Nā ngā tupuna he nā kupu. E hara nā mau ko Hemi. Yeah. And then him, ko Taranaki te pauherenga waka, te pauherenga iwi, te pauherenga tangata, te pauherenga kaupapa. And so, the use again of the symbol of a pou, Taranaki being that pou, that central pillar, which sort of binds and unites the waka of Taranaki, the iwi of Taranaki, the people of our region, and also particular kaupapa that are relevant and of meaning to Taranaki. And so you hear that kōrero quite a lot, and it's a beautiful kōrero because it references ko tahitanga, ana ko tō tātou tupuna maunga te pou e ere nei a tātou. And so, we might have our differences, but, there's one thing that we have in common, and that's Taranaki, koia tō tātou tupuna maunga e tūnei. And, we always, I've always said, and if anything was to unite the tribes of Taranaki, it would be koro. And I guess that particular kupu kōrero there is an example of how Taranaki can bring us together.
Ka pai.
Well, haere tonu, I think e kōrero anō te poihi. Kei kona tonu te iwi e wakarongo ana.
Okay, ka pātō so te tatau. Maranga ake. Ho, kei te.
Ooh, can of worms.
Well, I thought, we thought about the this whole concept of the po, and useful. This is a karakia which many will probably be familiar with, and we thought it'd be quite useful to just talk about this particular karakia, and it has been used over multiple generations, and it's been recorded by particular tupuna, referenced in terms of particular acts relating to the maunga. This particular kōrero, ko te karepa, ko karepa te wakahawe, Hemi.
Kirapa.
Te kerapa te wakahawe. But I think this is really a beautiful karakia which speaks to the place of our maunga, because this karakia I taki ai te wā I eke nei rā rātau ki te tihi o te maunga nei a Taranaki. And so it was performed on the peak of Taranaki. And then when you think about, I'll do a couple of lines and then I'll hand over to Hemi. So I'll do the first two. Paua ki runga, paua ki raro. That's beautiful. Simple,
easy one,
but deep. In terms of, again, that sort of connection that we have between heaven and earth, or the sky and earth. And when we think about that in a deeper sense, and when I think about our maunga, and maunga throughout the country, maunga are among the largest and most prominent of all sort of landmarks and sacred sites to our people. And sort of, they're really special in terms of both the sort of physical and cultural connection that we have to our maunga. But, when you think about our maunga as being the highest sites, they form those natural links between heaven and earth. And, when we think about heaven and earth, that's both the sacred and the profane. E kupu pai tērā te poihi, te profane. Ko marama ki tērā. So, the good and the bad, right? So the sacred and the not too sacred. And I like that sort of concept because, those high points of our maunga are places that are untouched. Right? We ka kōrero nei ko ngā wāhi titohi au tō tātou maunga. And, and that's another kōrero probably for another night, because we'll be here for another hour talking about that one. But how Te Whitia likened Parihaka and our kāinga to those high points of the mountain being those places that were sacred, that were untouched from the profanity of the everyday life. So, paua ki runga, paua ki raro, really a long-winded way to say that sort of whole connection between, heaven and earth. Kei au koe pēr, Hemi, te paua ki tā more more.
Oh, geez. So the context for this is that, there was a large group of people that climbed the mountain in between 1850 and 1858 to assert a mana across the land. And so context is everything. Well, that's what I say anyway. Context is everything in understanding, why and how these, how our taonga karakia such as these are used. So the karakia was used when they placed a big po in the ground up on Taranaki maunga to assert mana across the land during that time, in case lest it be sold. And so the context, as Jamie suggests, is paua ki runga, paua ki raro, paua ki tā more nui no papa. And so that we are embedding, placing our connection, our unbroken connection between the earth and the sky, which the mountain, if you think the mountain is its own pillar and its own symbol of holding up the land and the sky in itself. And so what bigger assertion of mana is such that they've climbed the mountain and they've put their own pillar in to kind of embody and symbolize that act. And so So this kōrero about paua ki tā more nui, Jamie, what we were saying early on, that te tā more nui, although it talks to, there's one symbol on idea that talks to this taproot that goes deep and beds itself deep into the earth. And we've got this unbroken line between heaven and earth, such as this po or this pillar provides us. It also talks about the broad expanse of what's in between that, or what's in between heaven and earth, and which leads us to this beautiful place of he rongo, he aio. So it's a place that that space in between heaven and earth leads us to this I don't know if peaceful is the right word, but this
serenity,
place,
serenity, and equilibrium. Yeah,
that's right. Equilibrium for me. That's aio. Leads to this place of equilibrium. And tēnā tawhito pau kātu, which is reaffirming this pillar and this unbroken line that we have between heaven and earth. And at that point, standing on top of the mountain, we are here. Well, this is them saying they are symbolized through their physical place on top of that mountain from heaven and earth, and that we've reaffirmed our place.
So it's a declaration and a proclamation to the world, to the universe. Tēnā tawhito pau kātu, this ancient, unbroken relationship and connection.
E kore ua is the name for be moved or shaken. So we will never be shaken. E kore unu here, that pillar will never be pulled out or taken away. So we'll never be moved or fall. E kore hinga, it will never fall. E kore whārara, and it will never be shaken about. Tēnei pau kātu. This declaration and affirmation of who we are and our connection to this place.
So it's a beautiful context, right? Because it speaks Te Poihi to connection to place, connection to our tupuna, but it actually speaks to ourselves, right? So internally within, ensuring that we have a strong foundation, that we have strong connection, that we have equilibrium, that we have balance, that we have understanding of that ancient, unbroken connection to our identity and who we are. And, if we've got all of those things, e rongo he aio, what a wonderful place that would be, right? And of course, we're not in that state today because they're for certain reasons. But, if only we got to that place, and it would be a place that we would not be rattled, we would not be undermined, we would have a level of resilience that we could overcome all odds. And so, I think, this karakia, and as it's been used through the generations for taranaki and our connection to taranaki, it's just as relevant today, as we come through the sort of COVID at level 3, and, as we search for our foundation, as we search for our identity, as we look to form better relationships with one another.
Ka pai hoki rā, te pēr hei āpiti atu rā ki tērā kōrero. I think it's about, if you have a look at the word paua and its various meanings, context is everything. Establishing and being fixed ki runga, establishing and being fixed ki raro. Sort of like what Jamie and Hemi have explained about being confident, also about within yourself. So we can look at it imagery and have a look at the maunga and have a look at the tangible taiao, which incorporates the landscapes, skyscapes, and peoplescape as well. But we can also look at it in our internal beings as well, the non-physical, and using these to settle oneself within oneself. So using these karakia at a particular kaupapa, we can do that if we're establishing a name on a place. As we know that placing a name is quite important. We've seen that with Rua Taranaki, placing a name is quite important. This will carry that out, and this karakia will is the content that can be used to execute and carry out and confirm and consecrate that particular activity. So that's how important also these things are. They have a they have a relevance today in many contexts. So my encouragement is for us to use these types of karakia and get them back into our lives. So I think with that, waiho tērā ngā whakāturanga, that could be our closing karakia for tonight. We know that ko tahi haora kua pau ia tātou i tēnei wā. So not too bad, boys, not too bad, boys. Nā mihi kawakera ki tukuri mako, nā anō hoki tēnei o ngā whakāturanga, te whakātu ki ngā tōpito o te ao. He mihi kawakera anō hoki ki koutou rā kaha nei ki te torotoro mai tautoko ake anō oki, ia te kone mako o Taranaki. Tērā pēr ka whiu atu rā te rākau ki kōrua rā, Jamie, kōrua rā ko Hemi, hei kupu waka kapi. Rima hikona, noiho nei.
Pai, Jamie. O kia ora tātou. He kōmutu, hoi, whakamutu ake a tātou kōrero I runga I te ia o te mihi kia koutou e whakarongo mai ana. O te no he kōrero noiho tēnei, hei whāwhā mā koutou, hei tātari mā koutou, hei rangahau mā koutou. Ko te tūmanako ka whai pānga e nei kōrero kia koutou, e mahi nei o koutou mahi, e kimi nei, e rapu nei. Ko te tūmanako ka noho e nei kōrero hei tū āpapa, I te hei atu kōrero e mau nei ia koutou I roto I tēnā kāinga I tēnā kāinga. O te no ka mihi kia koutou o ka rongo mai na kai aku hoa, aku tuakana, tēnei ka mihi ake hoi no tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou.
Tēnā koe. Hoi no, he tautoko I ngā mii, he tautoko I ngā mii, tāhua tēnei te noho tahi ki te wā no I he nei kōrero. Hei waka ore, hei waka kore, I te hine ngaro me te ngākau o tangata, hoi te anō rā. E mihi ana ki a tātou, me tāku ki a tātou, kia kahara tātou ki te tiaki a tātou anō. Ki te āta wakaro, I hā tātou mahi I roto I ngā rangi kaimui te aroaro I tēnei wā o te uruta. Hoi no, he kuanga ngākau, he oranga ngākau tēnei te noho tahi, ki tō tātou ware kōrero I te pō nei no reira tēnā rā tātou.
Kāti, tērā pēr, we'll have a look at our last slide that we have, and mā taua karakia anō hoki, hei waka kapi ake I tō tātou ne hōtaka, hei waka pau anō hoki ngā kōrero kua wariki hia mai rā I tēnei pō. Hoi anō rā, paua ki runga, paua ki raro, paua ki tā more nui no papa, ki tā more nui no rangi. E rongo, he ai o tēnā tāweto pau kātū, e kore e uea, e kore e unu ia, e kore hinga, e kore pararā, tēnei te pau kātū e hai. Tūturu waka maru kia tīna, hui e.
Tai ki e.
Pō mari e ki koutou.
Pō mari e.